Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. This is our second episode of season 5, and we are pre-recording because I am currently at the European Association for Gambling Studies conference, which I'm very excited about. And hello to everyone who is there, everyone who is watching live. Please feel free to use the chat. We won't be able to address these questions live with Lars, but please feel free to use the chat to have any questions, comments, and have a conversation amongst yourself. So without further ado, I'm very happy and excited about this topic. I've been wanting to talk about facial recognition technology for ages, and it's been taking me a while to find the right person, but I am very pleased to introduce Lars. Lars Oleson is the founder and CEO of Xailient, which is bringing AI and FRT, facial recognition technology. We can just go with FRT from now on, to the world, including to gambling specific cases, but not limited to that. And I'm really keen and curious to get into the background, the details, and all the different ways that we can explore this technology. So Xailient is bringing computer vision, human vision to computers, which sounds pretty amazing. But in this current world of AI and technology, nothing surprises me anymore. So thank you very much, Lars, for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to it. Always happy to share. It's a really exciting field. There's a lot going on, and it is very complex, and there are lots of little detailed corners and things like that. So we'll do our best to hopefully shed a little bit of light and give everybody, a basic knowledge so you can go and find all the details for yourself and tell me what I got wrong.
Well, I think there's a lot we can get into. So I am imagining that people are annoyed they can't ask you a question live. So people can look you up on LinkedIn if they are so inclined. But we'll see how much we can get through. Before we get started into the background and an overview, because not everyone is familiar with FRT, can you just tell me, I know I've described you as sort of a CEO and co-founder, but how do you describe yourself when you meet people?
I mean, so much the same. I'm a serial entrepreneur. This is like the 5th startup that I've done. So I've had several companies that I founded, several companies that I've exited, not always the same ones. Startup life is a lot of ups and downs. But I also spent a long time at Symantec doing cybersecurity, and before that at Oracle doing big enterprise software. My last company before Xailient, I sold to Alipay. So I built a company in Indonesia that I sold to Alipay in 2017 for their Indonesian subsidiary. And that was really my first exposure to face recognition, because Ali, of course, is the world leader in the smile to pay. So they were using face recognition as part of the KYC, or know your customer process, to set up electronic payments so that you can avoid fraud and things like that, money laundering. But it also eventually came to be the actual medium of transaction. So if you're in mainland China today, you don't even need to carry your tap card. You can just literally smile.
Wow. So your background in payments and in security and software and privacy and biometrics are all so relevant. KYC, know your customer, anti-money laundering, AML, so relevant to the gambling field. So you stumbled your way in, willingly or not, and you have the right expertise, which is fascinating. Now, before we get into all the different case uses of FRT in gambling, can you explain, without taking us down the PhD of detail, but feel free to dip your toe there, what is the sort of basics? What do people need to understand about FRT so they can understand, what it means for them, and what is the current day-to-day uses? I mean, we've seen Ring doorbells, and we know this is in process. So what's kind of how does it work? What is it? And how is it currently being rolled out, before we get into the future applications?
Yeah. Okay. So I think one of the things that people really, it helps to understand that there's more than one type. And so a lot of the way that we talk about, and even some of the things that I'll talk about today, are massively simplifying in order to be able to help us all kind of get an intuitive understanding. Perhaps what's most familiar to all of us is the one-to-one face recognition. And this is like unlock your iPhone, right? And so what you've done is you have taken photographs of your face, and some of us remember doing this, right? Where you have to sort of do a bunch of this and it fills in this little circle because it's really trying to get a very, very high quality summary of your face, right? And so what it's doing while you're doing that, it's actually not taking a photograph. It is using the photographs to then create a mathematical summary of your face. And from then on, it's going to be comparing when you hold it up to unlock it against that original summary that it derived. So that kind of one-to-one process is something I think, roughly half of the audience probably does every single day. And that's really, I think, the most tangible application. At the other end is some of the more controversial and troubling uses, like we have heard about big dragnets, where law enforcement is just kind of scanning through reams of video and comparing it against all sorts of maybe low quality photographs, right? So nobody sat there doing this if you're a crook, right? But maybe there's one photograph of one person from one crime scene, and then you're trying to match that against video taken on a city street. And look, not surprisingly, that led to a lot of false matches and created, I think, a healthy skepticism and concern. And a lot of stakeholders, including regulators, stepped up and sort of said, hey, look, we need to do a better job of establishing expectations and setting standards. The leader here, of course, is the EU. They have recently passed the AI Act, which covers a lot of this stuff. And we can get into that. And then kind of in between, I think, are the things that are really interesting, right? So there's lots of reasons to be concerned about government and state actors using face recognition. There's lots of reasons to be concerned about video from public spaces to be used. There's there's just lots of things there that go beyond technology. But there are this whole other realm of potential applications, and some that are already happening, that I think are far less concerning. And you brought up Ring, and I'm glad you did, because that is, I think, the most, after iPhone, the next most adopted use case is actually at the front door. So today, almost 30% of US households have some kind of video doorbell. And not all of them, but they are starting now to have face recognition built into them. And actually the primary use case is it's effectively a mute button, right? Because if my kids are running in and out from they're playing outside and they come in and out the whole time, what I don't want is my phone going bing, 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 right? Oh, there's somebody at the door, there's somebody at the door, there's somebody at the door. So actually in this use case, what's happening is not one-to-many or one-to-one, but one-to-few. We've registered the members of the family, and sort of said, okay, look, if it's one of these 5 people, I don't need to know about it. Don't send me any messages. Don't interrupt me. Let me stay with my day. But if it's somebody you don't recognize, then I want you to act like a normal video doorbell. And so if you have, let's say, a postal delivery worker who comes up to your front door, it won't know who that person is, but it will be able to say, I don't know who this person is, and I'm now going to notify Lars and let him know. And this is a really important subtlety, right? Because what we have done is not recognize the mail delivery, right? So I don't know, this is Joe, the mail delivery man, right? What I know is this is a stranger. And generally speaking, when I talk to folks about this, everybody sort of says, hey, you know what, this is another kind of safe space to do that, right? This doesn't raise any particular privacy concerns. It's in compliance with most privacy laws in most jurisdictions, but it's a really useful application of the technology that doesn't kind of create big brother concerns. And then that tech is now also being used, in fact, to open the door. So last year it was a lot of products around, hey, it's the kids coming in and out, don't worry. But things that are coming out over the next 12 months, and a few are in market already. Literally, you don't need keys for your house anymore. You can just walk in, and that's got all sorts of really useful things. Obviously, for the family, I live by the beach. To be able to not carry your keys and lose them in the sand is great. But in households that have people who come from time to time, or you're house sitting, or you're doing Airbnbs, right? There's lots of ways now that you can extend the trust and access to your home without leaving, potentially exploitable digital keys all over the place. So that's an exciting space. All right, so you ask kind of how it works. So essentially what happens is when the camera sees a person, and that's sort of the first job to be done, it's sitting there looking at nothing most of the time, right? So most of the time it's just sitting there looking and saying, do I see any people? And do I see a face specifically? And if I do see a face, okay, now I want to wake up and I want to do something interesting. So I'm gonna look at this face and I'm gonna compare it to my list of family members or my list of known folks. And so what it'll do is it'll take that image. So typically what we use are in fact camera sensors. So it is in fact starting with an image, but it doesn't have to. And some folks are doing this with other types of sensors, right? Radar, which gives you 3D, or non-visual spectrum. So you can do this in infrared, you can do this in all sorts of different sensors. But typically people are still using image sensors because they're cheap. So you can take a photograph. Now what you do is you summarize that photograph with a mathematical function that gives you enough information about the face that you think that you saw that you can compare it, but it's not actually the whole face. There's a subtlety here that I think is important, which is that is a one-way function. So when people talk about face recognition systems and how they extract embeddings, or how they extract a vector, or how they extract a mathematical summary, or a face print, or there's all sorts of different words that computer scientists are using to try to help people understand what's happening. But it's unlike a thumbprint, right? If you and I leave a thumbprint, anybody can come and they can look at it and they're like, that's a thumbprint. The face recognition embeddings are much more complex, and they are only a one-way mathematical function. So even if, let's say, you had a face recognition system and you had a summary of my face, if you sent that to me, that would not be useful to me unless I also had your specific face recognition system.
Right, so you can't reverse engineer. If you've just got the code, and I think my understanding is a lot of systems some systems aren't actually recording.
Right.
Like actually making a video or storing an image anywhere. They're making a mathematical equation and they're saying this is user XYZ 5000, got probably a lot more than XYZ in there, but they're not actually recording a picture or an image somewhere that they're using to retrieve it each time. So unless you have the exact system in which it was encoded, you can't say put it into a different facial recognition system or any other software and reverse engineer and say this is what this person looks like.
Yeah, that's the state of the art, and that's generally true today. So, and I want to kind of position that a little bit carefully, right? Because a really sophisticated audience listening to this that maybe has expertise in cryptography would sort of say, hey, under circumstances X, Y, and Z, I could in fact extract that, right? So if you want it to be cryptographically secure, there are additional steps that we take. That's best practice that you should take. But as a practical matter, that hashing function, that one-way mathematical door, is not really reversible. And why that matters, obviously that has privacy implications, that has security implications. But most importantly, I think, is it means that in order to do anything at that point, you have to be intentional, right? So one of the big frustrations I think that all of us had in the early days of social media and other kind of digital technologies is that you give consent for data collection. And maybe it's, hey, I want to use your free email system and I'm going to consent to you collecting my data in order to be able to send me emails. And they took it, you gave them an inch and they took a mile, right? They were like, oh, great, now I own you, right? I'm going to track your phone. I know where you've been. I know every time you've opened it. I'm going to tell those stores that you've been in and out, right? Like they really exploited that consent. way beyond its original purpose. And the good news is that privacy regulators have cracked down on this generally, right? Not just in face recognition, not just in AI, but really across the board. Pretty much anywhere that has privacy regulations today has a concept of purpose, and where they're sort of saying, hey, look, if you give consent to a specific purpose, the companies can't then go and run with it and do all these other things. And usually that then creates this sort of next step objection, right? From folks that are like, well, how do we know that they are in fact, right, doing that, right? That they're not overstepping the consent that we've given them. Why should we trust them, right? The regulation says thou shalt, but that, doesn't necessarily mean that we don't sin, right? I think the barrier of technical hurdles, right? So when you have one-way functions, when you have decentralization, when you have distributed systems, it is now much more effortful for anybody to try to overcome that, right? Because you've taken this sensitive data and collected it into in the bad case, right? In the old ways, you took this sensitive data, you collected it into a central place. It was all really easy to read. And so it became very tempting for your insiders to kind of be like, oh, let's open the lid of the box and see what's inside. Modern technology and the way that face recognition works at the state of the art today, it's running on the edge. So it's inside the camera itself, which means that you're not collecting data. So your camera is looking at the person, saying this is person XYZ 5000, they're here. I can unlock the door, and that's it, right? That's the whole job to be done. It's done. It hasn't collected an image. It doesn't even necessarily have to record the fact that event took place. And so you don't have this honeypot of data to be abused.
And I think that's what the first FRT in gambling in New South Wales, they've started putting this in venues as a way of upholding self-exclusion. And this is happening in other venues around the world, that there's you've consented to self-exclusion, you've taken a picture, very consentful, you have to actually take a picture for the process, for the purposes of being identified when you try and enter either the venue or the gaming area of the venue, and that there will be these cameras set up to alert staff should someone who's on the list, so it's sort of the, letting you know when the kids come in, but not anyone else. It's only alerting when someone who is on the do not enter list comes in. So is that, do you think, the most broad use of it in gambling at the moment?
So in Australasia, yes, right? So or especially in sort of Australia and New Zealand. So here, I think we've got very robust rules around self-exclusion and other protection measures for anti-harm. Face recognition at entry and exit casinos kind of everywhere is definitely something that frankly is now just normal, right? I think it'd be unusual to find a casino that wasn't using it in North America. There, I think the use cases are also heavily around disrupted patrons or people that have been excluded by the venue for other reasons. Sure. And so this kind of goes back to that consent, right? Like, how do we decide if somebody's on that list to be recognized? For sure, the most socially comfortable person or reason to be on that list is I have opted in, right? I have made an explicit decision. I have said, please do, in fact, recognize me and provide this protection. The next, I think, most comfortable sphere is where there's been some sort of a law enforcement or government agency that has done something similar, hopefully under the supervision of a court, right? So, these folks are on a register of, properly vetted due process, but are, sort of saying, hey, this person's a money launderer. We want to know if they show up. And then it progresses from there, right? And I think it's generally in most jurisdictions, it is permissible for venues, including casinos, to have a list of folks who have been who are excluded from the venue, right, for whatever reason, right? They've shoplifted, they've been disruptive in the past. And how far you go down this list, it starts to become increasingly uncomfortable for different stakeholders. And I think this is also where getting good, crisp regulations really helps. Because what I see today is in jurisdictions where there is clear guidance, everybody wants to do what they're supposed to do. In jurisdictions where it is not yet specified in law, you're subject to different people's interpretations of what's the right balance between social good and private protection or private gain.
For sure, because if the venues are recorded, they can use it for detection of self-excluded individuals or risky play. They can also use it for detection of potentially criminal or disreputable activities, but they could also use it for marketing. Joe's come in every 3 weeks. We haven't seen Joe in a while. Let's make sure we pull up Joe's profile and send Joe some free credits to come in. Who owns that data? Who has the right to use it for what purposes?
Yeah.
We've got
to be clear, they do, right? Like
that.
Yeah, that is happening, Sally, right? So, the politics of what we do and don't want to permit, right, I think is appropriately a political decision, and it's not for me as a technologist to decide, and it's probably not something that we're going to have one set of rules everywhere, right? And I think that's fine, right? Personally, I think it is appropriate for each jurisdiction to decide for itself what rules they want there. Where I think best case scenario where this data is being used for marketing purposes, it's under this kind of umbrella understanding that, look, you've got to pay for these systems somehow, right? And so if you're going to have face recognition systems that are delivering any money laundering benefits and harm minimization benefits, then using those for marketing with groups of patrons that are not problem gamblers is an acceptable balance, right? As long as those patrons have opted in and other kind of protections are put in place for the general public.
Well, I think there may be various views, I suspect, if we were live right now, being expressed on what is appropriate. And then again, but without getting into what's appropriate for marketing for gambling in general, say we're talking about a consumer store or something else, it depends on, I guess, the reason that the company's putting it in. If they're required by regulation to do it, then, that's different from if they're choosing to do it. And, there's all sorts of different ways. And I guess that's why it's really interesting to look into, because there's the reason it's put in place, and then it's all the other use cases that become available after it's there. I mean, I was at a presentation recently about venues installing charging stations for EV vehicles, which, as benefit and consumers come, and it's actually beneficial for them to slow down the rate at which you can charge your vehicle, because if you can charge it too quickly, people just sit in the car, but they actually want you to go inside. So, and then you can actually sell electricity back, so there's all these kind of like what it's initially for, what you tell the consumer it's for, and then what's actually going on. So as with everything, this will continue to evolve. So, this monitoring in the venues is one aspect. What are the other applications you're seeing now or potentially in the future of FRT in relation to gambling? And there's also obviously recognition, so biometrics. You are looking at customer accounts and more account-based gambling, both in venues and online. So facial recognition could be part of, the sign-in process, actually unlocking the machine. What else are we thinking about?
Yeah. So for sure, carded play is going away, right? So which is not to say that rated play is going away, right? So I think rated play is expanding and is likely
rated play, you mean like associated with an individual, like account based?
Right. So what we have typically globally today is you can play basically anonymously up to certain limits, right? Limits in time, limits in money, limits in cash, whatever. But there is still almost everywhere some amount of play that folks do that's totally anonymous. And this is a problem, right? This is where the money laundering happens. This is where harm minimization methods can be overstepped, or you can slip through a lot of cracks, right? So for example, here in New South Wales, I can just go from venue to venue, right? There's nothing that prevents me from hitting my limit in one pub and going to another pub, or hitting my limit at the casino and then going out and gambling in a pub. And so there's this benefit to being able to rate or track the player, and that could be in a de-identified way, right? We don't actually need to know that that's Sally, right? It's good enough to know that player 123 has spent 2 hours and 59 minutes at venue A. So when they come to venue B, we should not allow them to play anymore because they've hit their 3-hour limit. And so there's quite a lot that we can do there with rated play.
So I just want to unpack that a little bit more. So you're saying that because currently a proposal of account-based play is you have to sign up. So, you either play anonymously just with cash, or you sign up to an account and you put your loyalty card in, so you get bonus points and things like that. But then the venue can also track you, so they can tailor promotions or harmonization, whatever it is. But this is now talking about a camera being at the machine level could track an individual that hasn't enrolled in this program across the venue or even between venues. Can you kind of give us a bit more of detail about that?
Sure. So going back to kind of like the way that it works that we talked about at the front, right? So, we could have one person in that list, we could have 6 family members, or we could have, however, 100,000 excluded gamblers, or we could have the 100,000 excluded gamblers and 500,000 people who opted in, right? So just like I said, I want a card, now I'm going to say, I want cardless cards, right? I want to be able to play. I'm gonna agree to use my face instead of a card. I don't have to worry about leaving it at home or somebody, picking it up or whatever. So that same system then would be able to recognize a person. So let's just say random person X sits in front of the machine, right? We're gonna do this mathematical summary in the camera, right? So there's no image actually taken, but now we have this face print, if you will, that we can compare against those 600,000, right? The 100,000 excluded patrons and the 500,000 people who opted in. Now, if it's anybody else, it doesn't necessarily have to track them, right? It might just be like, oh, no, it's not one of my list of people, right? That's one way to use that system. There is another option here, right? Which is if the regulators so choose that they would then say, okay, actually, we're going to go ahead and create a 600,001 person here, and track that for some period of time in case they hit their limits, right? And so you might say, okay, that record, even though that person didn't opt in explicitly, that record is going to be kept for 24 hours or 7 days or whatever those limits are that the regulators want to be able to enforce across venues or with uncarded play. And again, I think what's really important here is for the regulators to be stepping up to give to make these decisions about, do we want to be doing that and under what purposes and conditions? Is that only good enough for, is that only to be used for harm minimization, which is probably a socially acceptable thing, but then what we would say is you're not allowed to use that for marketing, right? That only the 500,000 that opted in, that data could be used for marketing. So there's definitely a balance.
It's really interesting because there's a lot of onus at the moment on venue staff to say, okay, you have to identify people who've gambled, for 3 hours without taking a break. And that's a general indicator. If they go 5 hours, you have to have a conversation. There's all these parameters that are very, very difficult for staff to actually observe and make records. And so we've got systems in place that are going to monitor it. But because you've got anonymous play, it's very difficult to track, from the machine. If you sit on a machine for 3 hours, and it can probably alert you. So then there's people who've got algorithms and things like this if you play with your loyalty card. But when you don't have a mandatory loyal card, it's very difficult. So this is a really interesting way to say a system could anonymously track people. And obviously there'd have to be a lot of communication explaining to people we're not physically taking a photo, we're not storing a photo, so you can ensure the privacy. The government isn't monitoring you. The police can't come back in and reverse engineer it. So you don't have to address the privacy, but it would be a way for fairly seamlessly implementing some alerts or hard limits. You could lock the machine after 3 hours, or you could communicate, send a message to that machine to communicate, because you don't necessarily have the individual's contact details or name. You don't actually have any information about them. You don't even have their face. So you can't even send a message to the venue saying the person in the blue sweater, because the machine doesn't actually know what they look like.
That's right. Yeah. So I think the one way to think about this, and we we use this in in consumer electronics, is you can ask the camera a question, right? So, and you can send that down to them, but then they can't answer anything else, right? So the fundamental protection here is, your ability to sort of say to a camera, hey, has this person been playing for 3 hours, right? And it can be like, yeah, oh yeah, it has, right? Okay, well then we're gonna stop the machine, but that's all it's going to tell you, right? It's not, you're not asking it this open-ended question of, oh, well, who is this person and what do they look like? And, yada, yada, yada. It's like, no, all it knows how to do is the thing that you told it to do, which is to, watch and lock them out after 3 hours. Okay, well, that's what I do. And that's one of the advantages of these sort of decentralized systems where the AI is running on the device. It's a really, really simple system. It's designed to either unlock your front door or lock your slot machine or whatever that is. And there's just these built-in technical protections that I think help us minimize the risk, right? I mean, not necessarily gambling risk or your type of risk, but like minimize the societal risk in general, right? This is not Skynet, right? This is, dumb little thing that does one job and that's it.
Well, I think that would be a good step for consumers, that first step. And I'm going to get around to what the consumers, but I want to push you a little bit further because cameras can tell you how long, someone's physically been in front of it, or if it's super cool. They can track it, someone across a venue or between venues, based on, time on device or things like that. But as we become more sophisticated, I've seen some of the tech you've got around sentiment detection. Can you tell us a little bit around, it's not just whether that person XYZ is there, it's how person XYZ happens to be looking right now?
Yeah, so it's face expression classification. And there is a correlation between our facial expressions and our sentiment or our moods. But if we're getting really precise, I have no idea what's actually happening inside your head, right? And that's an important subtlety for a lot of reasons, right? Because like as we talked about, I think what becomes potentially really interesting is, are there ways that we can identify gambling harm that are more nuanced than just, oh, hey, it's been 3 hours and 1 minute, right? Like we have this very blunt instrument because up until now, that was all that the technology could do, right? So now that we've got more ability, then we might be able to have more sophisticated harm minimization. And so like the hypothesis here, right, which I think would be really interesting to study, right? The hypothesis is that, if somebody's been playing and there are changes in the way that they play, and those changes in the way that they play correlate at the same time with unusual affect, right? Their face is doing something that we wouldn't expect. And I came to this, right? You're the right, when we had coffee, like I came to this with sort of the theory that, oh, hey, if somebody's losing lots of money and getting angrier and angrier or sadder and sadder, like that's a sign of harm. And if they're winning a lot, great, right? But actually, I think one of the things that you highlighted to me is that maybe the risky situation is the lack of affect, right? It's just like, I have a totally blank face. I don't care if I'm winning or losing. I'm just hitting this button because I'm entranced. Or even the reverse, where as I'm losing, I'm getting happier and happier because I have the misperception that by losing, I'm getting closer to a win, right? And like, that's maybe the unhealthy matchup. And so what I think gets, the potential here is that we can use some of this data about facial expression, some of the data about the play in this session, maybe some of the data about the play of this player over time, right? Let's say last month they, came in and played $50 2 weeks out of 4, and this week they went all of a sudden up to 500 or 1,000, right? And at the same time, now there's something wonky going on with their affect. Like maybe this is an opportunity for us to intervene before those 3 hours, right? Before the loss limits kick in, before whatever else, but actually send a message. We won't be able to send a photo, but send a message to to either the machine or send a message to the venue to sort of say, let's go tap on the shoulder and be like, hey, what's going on? How are you doing? Right? Like,
oh, absolutely. And I think I really liked your characterization, the correcting me and saying sentiment detection and clarifying that it is facial expression classification, which is much more important, because it was put to me, I was involved in a matter where someone fell asleep in front of a gaming machine, and I suggested that that was likely a sign that there was a problem there, and the person said, well, how do you know? They just were really tired. And I said, yeah, well, but they were sitting in front of a gaming machine, like it seems fairly unlikely that's where they would choose to have a nap, but and they said, but you're making the assumption that they were gambling. I said, you're right, I did make the assumption that before they fell, like when I did presume when they were asleep they weren't gambling. But I think we do have to be mindful of the fact that we're not saying this is going to start to lock down machines and there's going to be an AI policing this, but it's going to be part of the information that the venue, the staff, the individual themselves can have. Like, I think it would actually be really interesting to alert the individual, send that message, like, you just had a really big win, you didn't seem to react at all. Are you like, that would be information you can feed back to the individual themselves, and to be like, oh, yeah, like maybe that is unusual, so
yeah.
this information is just information we're having, and it's really the next step. And again, it's not the role necessarily of the technology producer or the government. You would need information, but what do you do with that information? And that's where obviously we need a lot more knowledge about, is it the anger, is it the sadness, is it the tiredness, is it the neutrality, probably a mix of, and there's going to be parameters within it. But it's fascinating of the potential. And I know someone, well, maybe not, but when I first heard about this, my thoughts are, well, this sounds like a marketing where you're the computer machine again can be like, oh, you're looking a little bit tired, like, I'll do something else, or like, you just have to obviously be appropriate around what you do with it. But it's really interesting, the potential applications.
Yeah. And I mean, look, I think, there's some there's potential for real-time stuff, right? Like, we talked about this a little bit too, right? About, so kind of everything you just said. And then there's also the potential that maybe where this data is really useful is in large numbers, right? It's longitudinal, large populations, and we can come back and revisit some of these limits and actually back them up with better data, right? About like, oh, actually, maybe it shouldn't be 3 hours, maybe it should be 2.5 or 2:45 or 3:15 or whatever. But yeah, I mean, just being able to gather more data, being able to put that into the hands of folks like you, frankly, right? To help us, craft a system that is more sustainable. One of the things, I came into this industry accidentally, right? Like our background as a company really was in consumer electronics and in other applications that needed to use face recognition. And originally I was a little skeptical. So we had a big partner who pulled us into this account and recommended us. I started meeting gaming people the first time just a couple of years ago, and sort of was expecting a very cynical and jaded view of this kind of harm and was pleasantly surprised that that's really not the culture that I've experienced. Right, the folks that I've met do see this as, I mean, partly they're actually pretty good human beings, right? And they don't want to be causing harm and not being able to sleep with, look at themselves in the mirror and sleep at night. But I think there's also, no doubt an element of pragmatism behind that, right? I think everybody realizes that that problem gamblers are probably the biggest long-term sustainability threat to that line of business. So, I think the incentives are aligned, fortunately, that there's a genuine desire to actually prevent problem gamblers from gambling.
I think that's it's a really interesting, and there's so much that can be done from a harm minimization. Even if you think about the harm minimization from a harm reductionist point of view, where potentially there's actually evidence that there's much more car crashes on people leaving gambling venues related to fatigue. And obviously when you're fatigued, you're actually making poorer decisions. You know, I've got a lot of colleagues who work in neuroscience, and sleep is a huge issue. You know, just FYI, please don't anyone ever make important life-changing decisions when you are not fully rested. It is definitely not a good idea, which is why fluffy slippers are sold more on Amazon after 2 a.m. So, you know, you should never buy anything on Amazon late at night either, especially for next day delivery. But, you know, people make poor decisions. So, you know, it's not even just detection of people with gambling problems, but detection of when people are at the right point of time to be making decisions, you know, suggesting when people need to go have a coffee or maybe don't drive home, or here's our complimentary shuttle. But like there's just lots of different applications. It's not always about problematic gambling or money laundering. You know, there's a lot in the middle there that if people think creatively, if people are empowered to get the information back for themselves, I just think it's a really exciting potential. Obviously, we have to be mindful of the safeguards of potential nefarious uses of the technology. But I'm wondering what your sort of feedback is from various groups. Have you, you know, whether it's regulators or industry or really importantly consumers, because I can see lots of alarm bells going off in people's heads saying, okay, great, we've now got a camera in your gaming machine or at your casino table that's going to allow us to track how you're feeling. You know, what people are very concerned about privacy and hacking and security. So, but at the same time, they're putting their lives on Facebook. So, or TikTok or whatever we're on at this particular point in time. So there is this kind of flip-flop privacy divide where people say they're concerned about something and then act in a different way. But what's the general consumer sentiment towards the various applications of facial recognition technology?
So look, I think it's different in the US, it's different in Australia, it's different in Asia, right? So a lot of this, you know, it is societal and kind of what the sentiment is in different populations. The trend is pretty clear, right? Like as people get exposed to systems like this more and more often, and I think as they see responsible Western companies taking up the mantle of doing it properly, then they're getting more comfortable, right? So case in point, Apple, right? Like Apple has made privacy and trust very much a front row seat of their brand identity. And as a consequence, basically everybody admits to using the face unlock, even right out of the shower, right? Like, you know, you're not wearing anything, you're not worried about it at all. And it's because they've said, hey, look, we're not collecting images and we believe them, right? So I think there's two sides to that, right? One is to not collect the images, and the other is to establish enough accountability for your organization that people believe that, right? And regulators can help with that, but brands don't have to wait for regulators to do that, right? And casino operators or, you know, pub and club operators don't need to wait for regulators to do that either, right? You can step up and sort of say, hey, look, you know, modern brands need to establish trust with their customers around data transparency and data use in general, right? Okay, yeah, we also now extend that to AI. And if the next set of AI things that you want to roll out are some of these computer vision and smart camera type technologies like FRT, then of course, right? Like, you know, it shouldn't be novel or news to anybody who's responsible for a brand today, actually, that you're going to need to have privacy statements and transparency, you know, clear to your customers kind of through their whole journey.
Yeah, and I also think there's a big difference between, as you say, the sweep, which is, you know, CTV on the streets, and if you're walking into a licensed premise, knowingly engaging in a specific highly regulated activity, there is a level of appropriateness of saying, okay, well, to do this, you need to give up, you know, X. So that it's different case use depending on what exactly is going on.
And look, and there are important differences here, and they are not blurry, right? So the good news is that actually Australia has pretty robust privacy principles in the Privacy Act, but most jurisdictions now have in fact clarified a lot of these kinds of things, and I think there was a lot of abuse of the blurriness in the past, where, you know, companies would say, oh, well, you know, I've got face recognition and I've got cameras outside my door, so I'm going to track everybody on the street because, oh, I can't tell the difference. And of course, that was specious, but that was sort of how it was approached. modern best practices, and in most places now regulation, really they tie back to purpose. Why are you collecting it? What are you using it for? But they also distinguish between bystanders and non-bystanders, right? So, if I walk up to your front door, right, I might be a bystander, right? Because I have not opted into your face recognition. So you have to handle me differently than if your partner walks up to your front door and they've signed up and it's, unlocking for them. Absolutely the case, in venues, and where you choose to draw that line. Do we draw that at the front door of the venue? Do we draw that at the VIP section of the pub? Do we draw that when the person sits in the chair? Or do we draw that line when the person sits in the chair and actually tries to activate the machine, right? Like, all of those are decisions that need to be made by policymakers. Today, those policymakers are the general counsels of these organizations, right? Or the other operators. But where regulators choose to step in to make those decisions for them, great, right? Frankly, I think it's good for all industries to just have clear lines, because it establishes trust with the public.
I think this is hopefully this webinar is really helpful for a lot of people learning about this as the regulation is going in place. So for all the regulators, and I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to hand over to you to give your ask to the audience of what you want people to be thinking about and doing. But my last question for you is, what are you super excited about?
So look, the rate of change that we have seen over the last few years, I think, is really just the beginning. So if we think about like all the exciting things that have happened over the last few years with AI, with Gen AI, all of these are tethered to big, expensive servers. And where we are right now is just at the beginning of low cost, small form factor, battery powered, all sorts of novel physical systems that allow us to integrate the real world and the digital world. And the first of these that you're going to see is, you're going to see door locks that just, your home door is just going to open for you, right? Just kind of like the sliding doors at the office, except that now your door does this for you at home. The lights come on. There's all sorts of really cool stuff that's happening at home. But we're also going to see it in a lot of other places. You're going to see it in changes at the way that the coffee shop works, changes at the burrito place, changes at the grab and go, right? Like the inflection point in not just cost, but cost and size and power of these kinds of devices is super exciting. And so this change that we've seen kind of only on our screens for the last couple of years, you're going to start seeing out there in the real world. And it's going to be really cool. It's going to be really exciting. And we'll look back now and be like, oh, that was so primitive.
Always the way. Well, before we finish and wrap up, what I want to give you the opportunity is, if you have any, and unfortunately we're not live, but what would you like to say? Our audience include researchers, regulators, policymakers, industry, community treatment providers. Have you got, a request or an ask or something you want people to think about or start doing?
Yeah, look, I think my ask is to avoid the knee-jerk reactions on all of this stuff, right? Data collection, AI, computer vision, FRT, there have been, I think, quite a number of folks over the last decade who have acted irresponsibly, right? And that has fortunately led to a lot of innovators stepping up into the responsible AI movement and stepping up into privacy safe technologies. And what companies like Xailient recognize is that people want these technologies, right? They want to be able to open their door. They want to be able to play safely, right? They want to be able to do these things. And if we implement them appropriately, it is technologically feasible to have the balance. You can have your cake and eat it too. And so the knee-jerk reaction that says, oh, all AI is bad, all face recognition is bad, right? All data collection is bad. It's not implementable, but what it does is it also leaves us in a mode of importing the worst practices from countries that don't care about these things. Right? And we know what that looks like. We've seen that, right? And so we have this window of time right now, in part, frankly, because there are sanctions that have been put in place against some of these companies that participated in human rights violations. But that's the same technology that everybody's been complaining about, right? They sold it to one government for horrible reasons. They sold that same technology to all sorts of people globally for maybe legitimate reasons, but it had all those flaws, like it had all those risks built into it. The newer generation of technology, I think, has been built in line with the newer generation of best practices, the newer generation of regulations, to say, okay, we want these things, we need to do it right. And so what we want, hopefully, from regulators and researchers and stuff like that, is the nuances. How do we keep the balance? How do we deliver these products so that we're not stepping on societal risks, right? And societal landmines.
Yeah, which are constantly changing. So it's not an easy task. Attitudes change, what's possible changes in attitudes. So it's a huge circle. But look, Lars, thank you so much. I knew this would be super interesting and informative. And I'm sure that everyone watching is going to really have gained a lot. They can check out Xailient and your profile to find out a bit more and get in contact with you. As always, a huge thank you. And thank you to everyone watching the Technology Risk and Gambling webinar series. I'm excited to announce that we are going to finish the season in November with our favorite event of every single season we do, which is the Early Career Researcher Showcase. So if you know an early career researcher, that can be a PhD student, an honours student, someone recently graduated from a PhD, please encourage them to send me an email with some details, and we are going to put together a lineup. We actually usually end up being a bit oversubscribed, so get in early. If you know anyone who wants to be part of our Early Career Researcher Showcase and has a research topic that they have been working on related to the technology risk and gambling themes that we're talking about, please send me an email. My details are online, Sally Gainsbury, sally.gainsbury@sydney.edu.au. And otherwise, stay tuned and we will be back next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sally.